To reduce front wheel lift on MotoGP motorbikes and reduce the chance of the bike wheeling and flipping out of control, flow redirectors, as seen in this figure here, are used. But by the rules, there are limits as to how big they can be. Ducati snuck around these rules and made theirs bigger by making the bike in this area thinner. But did it work? How effective are these flow redirectors and what are their exact effects? To find out, we're looking at this paper called Research on Aerodynamics Study of MotoGP Motorcycle Flow Redirectors. It's open access, and you can find the link below. And the DOI is at the bottom of the first page for those interested. And in figure 8 there, we saw a bunch of different geometric parameters that are governed the shape of this flow redirector. So we see here we have a bunch of different things from phi, beta, alpha, L, HF, etc. But before we get into that, let's first cover what their purpose is to begin with. Why would you want flow redirectors in the first place? Well, lift is a major problem for motorbikes, especially if that lift occurs over the front of the bike. That not only reduces handling, but also poses a safety concern because the bike might flip out of control. So the idea of using these flow redirectors, which are effectively guide vanes on the lower sides of the bike, is to use the flow around there and redirect it underneath the bike at around the lower level height and perhaps even under the bike. Interestingly, the exact effect of these redirectors aren't really known still. So for example, during the author's writing here, they call that the lean mode, which is where you lean the bike to the side as you go around a corner. The lower side of the bike effectively becomes a diffuser that increases downforce, like we can see in figure 9 here. And this is an unknown effect in terms of how the flow redirectors will affect this general phenomenon. Then, even when the bike is upright, the director effect on the flow here is argued to even increase the lift because of how it directs the flow down, and from a front motor's point of view, that makes sense because if you were to throw fluid down, that's going to push you higher. But there's also an argument that even though it increases lift locally, by redirecting some of the flow to the lower part of the fairing, it might lower the pressure underneath the bike and increase the downforce overall. But then there's also another idea that the flow redirector moves some of the air away from the back of the wheel, so the wake there, there's dirty flow, and that could reduce the drag of the motorbike then. So there are all these many potential benefits, potentially, and there's only one way of knowing what the reality is. So let's get into what these researchers tested. So first of all, in figure 12, we see the bike model that the researchers used. And they were very keen to say that they made this motorbike quite similar to the Ducati by making the lower part narrower. That means they could use larger flow redirectors, as Ducati has done as well, without directly incurring a penalty. So the first thing that governs the flow redirector's geometry that we're talking about is the beta angle, which we see in figure 8 here, is pretty much how the top of the side of the inlet fans out, so how much it flares out. The authors looked at two different degrees, 25 degrees and 40 degrees. I'm quite curious to see the effects of this angle and how it affects really the flow around it, because on the face of it, it doesn't seem too important, but during the leaning mode of the motorbike, perhaps this changes how the air around the front is funneled away. Anyway, the second important angle is the alpha angle, which we can see in figure 8b. This is effectively how forward the inlet is angled. They tested 0 degrees and 10 degrees. And to me, this is probably an important angle because I would think like if you were to angle it forwards more, you'd capture more of the flow and maybe funnel it down more. But we'll have to wait and see if this is the case. The other geometric parameters in these pictures that we see here are fixed, and their values were given in table 10 above in this paper if you want to see them. They're really only looking at beta, alpha, and a couple other situations as well. So to investigate this flow redirector, the researchers used the CFD, which is a decent choice. One simplification that they made was that they cut the bike effectively in half and they ran a symmetry plane down the middle of it. So what I mean by that is, let's say we have this picture here in figure 12a. In the middle here, they say we're only going to simulate the left half of the motorbike. Then we're going to mirror whatever happens on that left side into the right side too, and that's going to be the entire flow field. Now, this isn't a great approach because a bike isn't completely streamlined. As such, the flow isn't symmetrical left and right. So putting a symmetry plane down one side and mirroring it isn't completely accurate. But the reason they did this was to increase how accurately they could model one side. What I mean by that is, so in figure 16 or so, we see the domain in 15, and then 16 we see some mesh stuff. If you have the entire domain, and let's say you have 10 million cells to spend, that's how much your computer can handle. If you have the entire domain, that means you have 10 million cells in that entire domain. If you cut the domain in half, you can now use 10 million cells in that half a domain, so it's equivalent to 20 million in the entire domain. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to make the motorbike finer in terms of the refinement. And in figure 16, we see that they did a pretty good job in terms of their mesh. They have a decent looking boundary layer mesh, which you can tell where you get close to the surface. There are these very well ordered rectangular cells. And they say that the Y plus value was 50, which is a little high, but still acceptable for the simulation because they use the KME SST terminus model. And that uses both the epsilon and the omega parts of the general terminus modeling. And that means that you can use a Y plus value anywhere from about 1 or even lower up to about 300 and still get pretty accurate results. Now, generally speaking, lower is better, but it's still quite good here. Anyway, that Y plus is pretty decent, but one thing that they could have improved really was that they used the regular RANS approach. So this is steady state. What that means is that the transient features of the motorbike, so let's say the wake flapping around, something like that, those things won't be picked up by RANS, at least not accurately. But now that we know that they used a steady state solver, the fact that they only simulated half the domain is actually fine now because the asymmetry in the flow won't be simulated anyway. So by making this half a domain, they can actually use more cells to get a more accurate simulation. And the two inaccuracies of using only half a domain and then using a RANS approach cancel out to actually make the simulation more accurate overall. It's pretty clever and it's cool when that happens. Now this CFD simulation was done with OpenFOAM, which is a completely free and very powerful CFD software. If you'd like to learn OpenFOAM, then check out our courses here. Now, the author simulated this at 50 meters per second, which is pretty quick. It's about the speed that you go around a corner fast, the fast corner. So about 180 kph. And one cool thing that they did test was the mesh. So they tested how changing the number of cells in their mesh affected the results. And that's very important because if you increase the number of cells, sometimes that can change the results. And you want to get to a point where increasing the number of cells in your mesh won't change the results anymore. And in table 5 and 6, we see the results of their study here. So table 5 shows that the 3 different mesh refinement levels here were 6.3 million for the coarse, 8.9 million for the medium, and 13 million for the fine. And that's really good because the number of cells increased quite a bit across this range. So they had quite a large range to see if indeed their mesh was conversional. And the value that they used to determine that was the drag coefficient. And you can see here that from medium upwards, the drag coefficient doesn't really change very much. It only changes by like 0.2 of a count. That is definitely within the error of the simulation. So we can really say that at the medium mesh and upwards, the CFD has converged. And as such, they used the medium mesh, which is completely good. In addition to that, in table 9, we see the results of the validation study. They have the drag coefficient area of the 2 other motorbikes, which are very similar to the motorbike that they used. They are both very similar in terms of their design and their lower fairing. And the drag coefficient areas are very similar among the 3 different bikes here. So I think it's safe to conclude here that the CFD is good for investigating the effects of these different fairings. Both the mesh independent study came back pretty good, or very good I should say. The results validation study is quite good too. So I think it's safe to say that the general trends are definitely fine to trust. So if we were to see that the drag increases or drops, we can really take that to the bank. And even the actual values themselves, not just the trends, but let's say they change by a few percent, we could probably trust that as well. Below a few percent, I'm not too sure, but within a few percent, I think that's fine. And knowing that, we can now jump to the results to see what they found. So in table 11, we see the lift and drag coefficients of the bike straight up. So if the rider was just going down as straight as fast as he or she could and sitting upright. And we have something interesting here. So we have when the wheels are rotating compared to when the wheels aren't rotating. Sorry, that's gone too far. Let's go to figure table 11 here because that gives just some data here. And we'll see those pictures later. So this is interesting because when the wheels rotate, the flow gets churned up differently. And for this simulation, the authors use something called a rotating wheel boundary condition. Now what this is a condition that you tell CFD, so your open foam situation here, that on the surface of the wheels, assign a rotation speed of whatever you want, 100 radians per second or whatever. So the wheels aren't actually moving, but it's a pseudo movement. And that is definitely one way to simulate rotating wheels. And here we see the effects of that and whether rotation is actually important or not. So for the drag coefficient, the wheel rotation really didn't change too much. It was only a couple percent of a change, which is probably within the uncertainty of the simulation. So for the upright position, wheel rotation doesn't really affect the drag coefficient too much. We could probably say you don't need to do it for that. But before we can conclude that completely, we look at the lift coefficient. And that's a different story. So with rotation, the lift coefficient increased by 20%. What that means is if you had no rotation compared to rotation, you have such a big difference for the lift coefficient. And this is almost certainly outside the uncertainty range. So wheel rotation during upright maneuvers definitely should be included in a CFD. When the bike is leaning, so in the table 12 here, the drag coefficient again drops a little, this time about 3% when you incorporate wheel rotation. And it's tempting to say now that, okay, we saw when the bike was upright compared to leaning over, the differences were about very similar and in the same direction, so maybe that's a trend. But again, the CFD results here are probably close to the uncertainty, so I'm not sure that we could really conclude that, okay, this is the result in terms of if you were to have the wheels rotating, then you would drop the drag coefficient by a few percent. I think we can't quite conclude that just here. These results might still be within the error bars. Anyway, for the lift coefficient, we can say that the wheel rotation is very important because here, when you're leaning over, rotation has an even bigger increase, and that's by 36% instead of 21%. So I think from a lift point of view, wheel rotation is definitely needed for this research, especially considering that it is how these flow redirectors affect the lift. So I think it's good that they made their wheels rotate overall. Now in figure 18, we see the effects of the wheel rotation on the flow fields now. So these pictures down here, we can now look at these. And this is now what the wheel rotation is doing to the flow field. So these are for different configurations, but the important thing here is that the left column is for no wheel rotation, while the right column is for wheel rotation. The flow is affected quite strangely with wheel rotation. So around the lower part and the middle part of the wheel, the flow seems to get kicked up more behind the wheel. But then behind the top of the wheel, the flow seems to get kicked down more. So I guess the thing that stands out to me is that with wheel rotation, the flow is being funneled more around the lower part of the bike compared to when there is no wheel rotation. And if that's the case, that then means that it's even more important to have wheel rotation in these simulations because the flow entering the flow redirectors will be affected dramatically because the rotation will be funneling more air that way and even at a different angle to if you have no rotation. So I think it's very important to have rotation here, and the researchers did that, so that's good. Now as a side note, if you want us to simulate your very own car, let us know here. We have quite a few customers who have done that and they've been very satisfied with the results, so check it out here if you're interested too. Anyway, let's move on to table 13, where we see the effects of different flow redirectors on the lift and drag coefficients. So in the so this table in general is quite tricky to understand. Let's go through it and explain what's happening. So in the leftmost column, we have some numbers, 1, 4, 6, 7. In the second to left column, we have simulation type, without rotating wheels, with the rotating wheels. We're going to focus only on rotating wheels because we've seen here now that wheel rotation is very important for this. And to be perfectly honest, that means that without wheel rotation, what's the point? I mean, you're not going to be going down a straight or on the corner with no wheels rotating, so what's the point of looking at that? So we're going to look at the wheel rotation, and then we look at the lift and drag coefficients, the values of them, and the difference between them. So first of all, in this table, the first important thing is those numbers, 1, 4, 6, and 7. These correspond to different configurations of the flow redirectors and the motorbike itself. And to know what these mean, we need to scroll back up to table 10 because they do list the different configurations based on these numbers. So they have different like for flow redirectors here, for example, number 1 means that the alpha, which is how much the flow redirector is angled forwards, that has an angle of 0 degrees, so it's flat. Then beta, which is how much is flared out on the sides, that's 25 degrees. Then we have flow redirector, which means that we don't have one. Now, let me explain what this means actually a little bit, the flow redirector. So the flow separator inside the redirector is this little vein inside that cuts it kind of in half. And the reason why you want that is because it helps keep the flow kind of going in the same direction that you want to go. If you don't have that inside, as the flow enters the redirector, it can just jumble around and you don't know where it's going to go. So here with the flow redirector, it's going to probably guide the flow better. So for the number 1 here, we don't have one in there. Then for the last case, leaning motorbike, no. So that means that the motorbike is upright. So that's what number 1 means. Comparing that to number 4, the configuration there, so this 4th row here, everything is the same except the redirector is now flared more, so the beta angle is 40 degrees instead of 25. That probably means that it should capture more of the flow there, I would imagine. And then there's also that we have the flow separator inside as well, the redirector. So that's what 1 compared to 4 is. And going back to table 13, we can now compare the two to see how the drag coefficient changes between these two. So we see that going between the two, we have a change of about 3 to 4%. And that means that flaring the redirector out more and adding a guide vane makes it more draggy. That's not great. And if we were to look at the lift coefficient, it is even worse because it increases by about 35%. So I think that means that overall it's worse because you don't want more drag and you don't want more lift either. So number 4 is definitely worse than number 1, the configuration there. Comparing number 1 to number 6, so back in table 10, number 6 was when we had the flow redirector is flared out more, it's flared to the same amount, sorry, so the beta is 40 degrees, oh sorry, 25 degrees. And now the alpha is angled 10 degrees forwards instead of 0 degrees for 1. There's also a flow separator inside the redirector, so that little guide vane. So the drag coefficient here has increased by about the same amount as before, a few percent, but the lift coefficient has now only increased by about 10%. So what that means is that still number 1 is better in terms of drag and lift because the drag is lower and the lift coefficient is lower too. That suggests that the flare angle is quite important for lift here. Let's now see what number 7 is. So in table 10, we saw that number 7 is just when you have a flow redirector that is flared out more, so beta is 40 degrees, and it's angled more forwards too, so alpha is 10 degrees as well. There's still no separator inside, and this is for the motorbike completely straight up. Now in table 13 here, we see that the drag increases a little compared to number 1, just a couple percent, but still the lift coefficient increases by about 10%. So again, this is still worse than number 1. And all this is very interesting, but in table 14, we see the same breakdown, but now for when the bike is leaning over. And with these tables, it's a little hard to pin down exactly what the effects of these different geometric parameters are because you're changing a few things at a time. So let's first look at figures 24 and 25, and then we'll come back to that maybe later. So 24 and 25, they show generally, on average, how these different parameters, so alpha, beta, flow separator, and motorbike lean, affect the lift coefficient and then the drag coefficient. So first of all, in figure 24, for the lift coefficient, it's very obvious that motorbike lean is definitely the most important thing. You can see just how great this slope is. It's by far the most important thing for lift coefficient. If you lean the motorbike, what this is telling us here is that you're reducing the lift coefficient, you're getting more downforce potentially. If you put it upright, the opposite. And that right there tells us that if you don't even have flow redirectors, leaning the motorbike is going to be more effective anyway than focusing on the redirectors. But if you want to increase that downforce or lower the drag, maybe the flow redirectors will help. Let's see. So it shows here that the left 3 plots here show that increasing the angle of the redirector, so alpha, putting it forwards more, reduces the lift coefficient. So that's good to know. On the other hand, if you flare the redirector out more, that increases the lift coefficient. So that's a little odd to me because to me, if you were to tilt the redirector forwards more, that's kind of like catching air more. But if you were to flare it out to the sides more, that's also like catching air more, but you're catching it in a different way. But they have very different effects on the lift coefficient as well. So in terms of the flow separator, let's move on to that. Having it increases the lift as well. So I think that makes sense because The flow separator is effectively a guide vane, and that helps direct the flow down more effectively. So that will produce more lift that way. Taking into account all of these parameters, in Figure 15, Table 15, we see the best configuration for reducing the lift coefficient with this flow redirector. And what they say here is from this Figure 24 and Table 15, the best angle for the front to be pushed forwards at, the alpha, is 10 degrees, so it should be directed forwards a little bit. Then you want to make the redirector slimmer, so the beta value should be lower. And then not to have any flow separator inside, and then definitely to make the motorbike lean. For leaning, that makes sense, and the flow separator makes sense too, because if you have the vane inside, that's going to be pushing the air down more, it's going to get more local lift. So those two make sense. As for alpha and beta, that's a little bit more abstract to me, I think, and the fact that they have different effects is still quite interesting, which we can't really see why here. Anyway, in Table 16, we see that if you wanted to make the best flow redirector to reduce the drag, the values you need are not the same compared to the lift coefficient. Some are, some aren't. So for example, for the drag, no motorbike lean is better than motorbike lean, whereas for the lift coefficient, you want to have the motorbike leaning. So right there, you can kind of choose between having lower drag or lower lift, but not both of them at the same time here. But anyway, having the flow redirector angled forwards more, we don't want that for the drag coefficient. We want it to be flat, but for the lift, we do want it to be angled forwards. Anyway, for both the lift and drag though, having a slimmer one, so beta should be smaller, that's good for both of them. So there are some characteristics that are good for both the lift and drag coefficient reductions, but the motorbike lean and redirector angles aren't those. You actually want the opposite here. And looking at Figure 25, which shows the sensitivity of the drag coefficient to these different parameters, we see some different trends now. So first of all, the alpha and beta angles, so how much the front of the redirector is angled forwards and how much it is flared, don't really make much of a difference here. You can see how flat these lines are. Like, it doesn't really matter. And what that actually means is if you wanted to make this flow redirector better overall, you wouldn't really have to worry about alpha and beta for the drag coefficient. It's more for the lift coefficient. So you can get the best values for the lift coefficient and not really worry about the drag coefficient, I would imagine. And that's good to know. Now, as for the flow separator effect, it's the same as the lift coefficient, where if you have one, that's bad for drag, and we don't want that. But we do get good, also less downforce as well. So perhaps here we could tentatively say that directing the flow under the bike doesn't increase downforce, because that's what the flow separator would probably do, direct more flow downwards. But I think more research is needed to conclude that properly, because there was some suggestion above in this paper that said that maybe there would be a reduction in lift and an increase in downforce if you were to direct the flow more underneath the bike. Maybe this flow separator wasn't directing in the right way. Finally, because a smaller beta angle is better, arguably Ducati's enlarged redirectors might not have been as good as what we might have thought, or maybe they are only good for certain bikes in certain situations, and this paper didn't look at those situations or particular bike. Maybe there's a tiny little difference that made a difference, but right now this paper is showing that the larger flow redirectors weren't as good. And with that, we come to this podcast. If you liked it, hit the me like and subscribe buttons, and if you want us to simulate your very own car, let us know here. And if you want to know how vulnerable you are to costs when riding on the back of someone's motorbike, check out this video here. Peace, amigos.